I think a lot of people, when they think about revolution, they're thinking about what maybe you would call like capital R revolution, which is to say you arm everybody, you get a huge mass of people together, and then they overthrow the government in a coup. That's not the goal. That, in fact, has a pretty bad track record. In order for that to be successful, the alternative has to be powerful enough to sustain itself after you've defeated the old system. And generally what you find is that, well, you're going to be using all the infrastructure, all of the structures and systems of the old world in order to do that. If your alternative wasn't prefigured far enough, then you end up just reproducing capitalism all over again.
With all the political instability going on around the world, which is really an extension of the failures of the capitalist economy, there is general confusion regarding what can be done to fight against the rise of fascism and authoritarianism. So, to clear up all the confusion, no one is better to talk to than Daniel, who has a fantastic channel called Anarch, which is a great guide breaking down the philosophical foundations of leftist ideas. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this talk. Let's get started. I want to ask you first, just define for us the principles of communism, socialism, anarchism. What defines them from each other? What separates them from each other? And is there mainstream leftist thinking, and is there the more, objective one?
Yeah, so obviously defining those three terms, you could probably spend entire books, like you could give entire lectures just on what any one of those three terms meant. But I think probably just good to get started is for me to say how I define those terms. So for anarchism, I use this term to mean the opposition to all hierarchical power structures and the desire to replace hierarchical power structures with horizontal power structures. Hierarchical power structures are those based in domination and monopoly over decision making. And horizontal structures are those based in libertarianism or distribution of power and things like self-defense rather than domination. So that's what I see anarchism as representing. That's not necessarily the way that you would see every historic anarchist define it, but you would see that those same elements are always going to be present in the historic definitions of anarchism as well. I just use this phraseology about power structures because I think it is useful for talking about how systems function. It's a way for us to use anarchism and systems thinking together. So as for the word socialism, that word is incredibly open to definition and has been defined many, many different ways. In fact, historically, socialism and communism have been used synonymously in certain occasions. There were times where the movement kind of just interchangeably used the words socialism and communism. However, over time, they did sort of develop a specific context, and they did tend to get used in more consistent ways. Communism, I would say, has a more specific and more kind of detailed description as to what it generally means. And it is a stateless, classless, moneyless society wherein economic distribution is determined from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. This is obviously society which it's clear just from the definition has abolished the market. It's a society which is a planned society of some sort or another. Money is not being used as a means for exchange. You have basically a free association of producers, and the products of the producers are distributed straight to people who need them. And so you have essentially a completely decommodified society. That's what communism is, and more generally has been defined as throughout history. Socialism, I will just say, I personally use the word socialism to mean worker ownership and control over the means of production. I think maybe even more importantly, it's worker control over the means of production. But even this word control is sometimes nebulous in the hands of certain people. Certain people think that, just the workers kind of being able to look at a plan that somebody else made and give a little bit of insight would be control. So it can, even then, with that kind of specified definition, be difficult for some people to recognize whether something is or is not socialist.
Okay, okay. So, would you agree with the wording like the Soviet Union back then was actually like what we call historical communism and not actual communism? Because obviously it had elements which were very close to the capitalist system, like authoritarianism. The state having control of everything, and it just being another form of hierarchical organization that was ultimately oppressive. I mean, it definitely was, in my view, doing better than the Western hegemony. Obviously, the capitalist system, we all know what it does to the world and to people. But what do you think? Like, there was a big difference, right, between what happened in Soviet Union and, actual communist ideals, and how it relates to like authoritarian leftism in general. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't even use the word communism to describe what happened in the USSR. I don't think that they ever even got close to what I just described as communism, right? There was a state, there were classes, and there was money. So, like, it's pretty straightforward that it wasn't communism. Yeah, I understand some people might want to like differentiate between like lowercase c communism and uppercase c communism, where they call uppercase c communism like what happened in the USSR, or the name for regimes that called themselves communist and so on. Personally, I don't really think that's appropriate. It gives people the impression that in any way they're actually associated with communism. They're really not. They don't haven't fulfilled any of the conditions that were just described, and there's really no evidence that they were moving towards the conditions that were described. We just have to really take them at their word that that was their goal, even though they made zero progress in that direction. I think it's more appropriate to call the USSR state capitalist, and sometimes people get a little confused, but this term state capitalist is essentially to say that the state took the place of the capitalist in the capitalist system. So it's not to say, of course, that they maintained private entities and so on, although they did actually. The USSR maintained private industry pretty much throughout its entire history. It's instead just to say that the role of the capitalist was subsumed by the state. The state just became the owner and employer of the masses, and the masses still worked for a wage, still produced things which themselves were sold as commodities on markets. All of those conditions remained. It's just that the boss changed is all that really happened. So yeah, I don't really describe anything that took place in these authoritarian leftist examples as being communist.
Good. And so that's important because there's so much, I feel, confusion in the activist community around the world. I feel like a lot of waste of energy, conflict really generated because of the fact that there's so much duality between capitalism and socialism in the world. And I feel like that constant struggle that's presented to the world, like there's different, we have this side and we have the other. There's no other areas of life or philosophy or economic organization that really matters. It's just capitalism and socialism. That duality has been pushed down across the world for so many years that it's really hideously oppressed the intellectual like flexibility of society. People really cannot think outside that. And when I talk to people out there in the street, or anywhere really, about the things I'm talking about. Like, I don't like the idea of a monetary system forcing people to have jobs that waste their life doing nothing, and a stupid, idiotic growth system that perpetually has to grow. So you have artificial demand from that. The whole thing makes no sense on any sustainable level. And yet we try to present them from like a scientific worldview and from like objective sustainability principles. They just say, oh, yeah, I'm sorry. What are you, communist? What are you, socialism? That thing didn't work. It never worked. So there's this like projected duality that's very, very dangerous because it's just wasting people's time. And so, I read that article that I told you that thought had like pretty good points by Peter Joseph. It's called like, it's very provocative. It says socialism, why socialism sucks. But basically, he has points in that article, which he's not like dismissing and being down on socialism. He's just saying that this is another ideologically perpetuated duality that's constantly fueling public discourse about this issue, and we're not getting to the more important topics such as systems thinking and I guess the science of organization when it comes to society.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably true to some degree that the words are obscuring our ability to discuss the topics. When I talk with, like, I guess you might call normal people or the average person, not people like us who are like really into theory and all this stuff, I don't start with the words, or at least I rarely do. I kind of, sometimes I'll get the vibe check on the person and I can just tell that maybe they'd be down for the conversation. But generally, I don't start with the words. The words tend to obscure the details of the conversation or make it harder to have those discussions. What I do instead is I basically just describe the things that I, you know, uh, used as the definitions earlier, right? Like instead of saying I'm an anarchist, I'll be like, yeah, I think I'm just against all hierarchical power structures. I think that we should have a society where power is distributed among the people and we make all of the decisions together and then we carry them out together. And when you phrase it that way, people all at once are much more favorable towards anarchism because they didn't really know that's what anarchism was. Or if you say, I just think that workers are the people who provide most of the value to society or all of the value to society. And so they should be the ones who own the products of their labor and their workplaces. And once again, you'll find a ton of people, if you just don't call that socialism, who are really down with that makes a lot of sense to them. Or you say, a society where we didn't have money and states and classes, that would be so much better as a society. We need to figure out how it is we get to that kind of society. And they're like, yeah, you just don't call it communism, right? And then maybe like a ways through the conversation, once you're starting to kind of get into the critical questions and now they're starting to think it through, then maybe you bring up, you're like, yeah, by the way, that's what people meant by socialism. Like when people fought revolutions for socialism, that's what they meant. Like when people fought revolutions for communism, that's what they meant, right? And I think that often has kind of a disarming effect and it causes them to reconsider what those words mean to them. But I think sometimes we get obsessed with getting people to agree with the words more than we do with trying to get them to agree with the concepts. So for me, I try to take that more systemic approach. And I think that it's generally much more persuasive to the average person.
Absolutely, I agree. Because there's like this whole morality basis upon which I think socialism and communism tries to argue, against capitalism. It's very much a moral basis, and it's not about the general bigger concepts at large, So the very concept that the state is counter-revolutionary. I watched your video, by the way. I listened to it. Great points made. Because the very mechanisms that keep the state together are the same that are gonna produce the same outcomes of controlling bias, right? Group tribalism, things of that nature. Yeah, can you explain that a little bit? Like from a systems based, right? Like scientific worldview, like from a human behavior like perspective, right? Because I think the legal system, and I think it has very much the same issue with the economic system. They operate very much on like a moral worldview. Who deserves more, who does the most, even though that's actually hilariously paradoxic because the people who contribute the least are the ones who make all the most money in the capital system anyway, doing their nonsense, silly transactions or whatever. So the entire thing is turned upside down, and there's a moral basis on everything. So anyway, my point was, the human behavior version of it. So how does the state, as a concept, just as an idea, produce hierarchical organization that's oppressive?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the state is, by its very nature, a hierarchical thing. So I guess what I'll do is I'll describe what I mean by a hierarchical power structure. So a hierarchical power structure is one where the vast majority of decision making in society, the major decisions that form how society moves forward, are made by a very small number of people. Obviously, that scales, right? Like you can have larger number of people and fewer number of people making the decisions. What I would say is that the fewer and fewer number of people that you have making decisions, that's more what I would call authoritarian, right? If you have a very, very, very narrow group of people making decisions, that's very, very, very authoritarian. I often use a second descriptor, or definitionally use a second descriptor for a hierarchical power structure, and that is that it functions on domination, which is to say violence, threat of violence, and deception. So it maintains itself through these features. It monopolizes decision making power in the hands of very few people, and it maintains that decision making power within their hands through the force of domination. And that is pretty much just what the state is, right? That's what the state is, always has been. The Marxists sometimes conceive, of course, that you could have a state that were otherwise, but we have never seen such a thing in practice. They conceive of it kind of abstractly, but when we look at their actual implementation, that it's always what I just described, a hierarchical power structure. Then by contrast, horizontal power structures, as I said, are kind of definitionally characterized by this concept of distribution of power, where decisions are made by a very, very large group of people. And once again, this is a scale. You can have more and more people involved, making it more and more libertarian in this sense. And the other impulse that's the opposite of domination is mutuality, things like self-defense, coordination, cooperation. These are the impulses of mutuality. So the thing about hierarchical power structures is that they are inherently simplifying of complexity. The universe is incredibly, incredibly complex. It is in almost no way simple. Nothing about it is simple, right? It is a complex system, and it is nested with complex systems in every single way. Our body is a complex system all by itself. Each one of us is an incredibly complex system containing many, many complex systems. And we are embedded in a bunch of different complex systems. And the thing is that when you try to simplify complexity, if all you're doing is kind of like gathering data, well, your data will be flawed because simplification of complexity just means you get bad data to some degree. It's really the danger and the damage comes in when the simplification that you did in gathering the data is then applied back onto the world, right? When that process of applying your simplified data back onto the world occurs, what you do is you try to strangulate the complexity of the world. You take your simplifications and you impose them on complexity. And usually it just doesn't work. Complexity is too much. It's overflowing, and it can't be simplified. It can't be put into the straitjacket. So instead your plans just fail. And that's what happened in the USSR all the time. They kept having these huge, grand plans, which James C. Scott says were high modernist, is what he calls it. This belief that you can just control nature and dominate nature in this sense. And those plans produced disastrous failures. Disastrous failures, not only in destroying the ecology, but also destroying the workers' movement. It annihilated the workers' movement in Russia. And so this is just what all hierarchical power structures do by their very nature. And somebody might be inclined to ask, why? Well, the answer is when you have a smaller and smaller number of people making decisions, that means a smaller and smaller number of people are receiving information. The information is being filtered through a smaller and smaller bottleneck, right? What you want, if you're trying to get a huge, complicated data set, you want lots of nodes for measurement, lots of tools doing the measurement, or a tool that has an enormous bandwidth for measurement, right? You need one or the other. But when you look at a hierarchical power structure, we're all just humans. Nobody actually has some magical special ability to gather all of the information that comprises the true complexity of the universe. So what they get by nature, is a reduced version of all of the data, which James C. Scott calls legible data. Data is made legible to those people. And by being made legible to a very small group of people, that guarantees the simplification process. And when they use domination, which is that other feature of hierarchical power, in order to impose it onto the world, it does horrifying destruction to any system that it interacts with. So that is the systemic reason. why hierarchy often leads to such disastrous results.
Yeah. Um, Now, I guess what we would try to do is get to the root of it to see, you know, what kind of mechanisms lead to that kind of behavior anyway. Where is the source of that behavior of this controlling? I mean, I would consider one of the worst things that capitalism creates is group tribalism or in-group, out-group loyalty, which leads to obviously naturally to competition. And competition, when you have nuclear weapons, that is the extreme of it, of course. But even looking at people competing for jobs in the market, that I can see as oppression because it's a completely forced game. It's not really being emergent in the way we think and operate in the 21st century. I mean, look at the things we have. Look at the technology we have at our disposal every day. The things we can do, incredible. Yet we have extremely primitive social mores, of cultural values that are imposed upon us from birth, so people don't question these things. And so ultimately it comes down to the values, right? So understanding what kind of social values would promote egalitarianism and cooperation and mutual aid and just yeah. So based on what you said, you talked about so much, I had so many ideas in my head, but because it's such a deep topic, if you want to go from any angle, but the angle of how about what do you think about social primates, right? So social primates, bonobos and chimpanzees. I love going to that example because it's so relevant. We look at the environment of the chimpanzees generally. I didn't even know this until I read about it. Like desolate desert kind of environments with the chimpanzees, so they're forced to compete with scarce resources because that's what's imposed upon them. That's the environment being real. They're not making that up. That's just the way it is for chimp society. They have no way, other way. So the chimps are brutal. The males are very brutal. They rape and they kill each other as well. And there's a strict hierarchy with the ones at the bottom clearly suffering not only from more violence and shame, but also from heart disease and other kind of stressors. Um, while the bonobos, because they live in lush rainforest areas, they have like egalitarian societies. They just have sex and eat food all day. There's just and the females actually have a lot more power in saying how things are done, but not in an oppressive way. They're like, somebody tries to get power, they shame them and beat them up. Like, how dare you even try to do that? So it's like that's a little bit of like a counter dominant strategies, as they call it. An inverted hierarchy as well with humans. I mean, sorry, I'm mixing them up. We go to human tribes, there's an inverted hierarchy where like it's not a hierarchy of resources and deservingness. It's a hierarchy of like, man, whoever has the most knowledge and qualification, they get to help us out. But that means they have a lot of burden to do to make the tribe do well. Whereas in capitalism is the complete opposite, flipped on his head. The people putting society together are the hard workers who don't make nothing. They're quiet. They don't get anywhere. In this mainstream society. But the ones who exploit the most, yes, you exploit the most, you get the most. In the society of capitalism. But
Yeah. I think what you're getting at here, and I kind of you had also primed me a little bit on the previous question, but I kind of blew over it a little bit. Is like the role of behavior, right? The role of conditions informing people's behaviors. And it's interesting because going back to Marx actually talked about this. He calls it social reproduction. Right. There's this process by which any given system reproduces itself at every linkage, right? It produces itself within the economy, it produces itself within the political structure, but also reproduces itself within our psychology and our behaviors and our expectations and our beliefs, right? And we ourselves sort of become formed by our environment. We become formed by the conditions that surround us. They sort of form the horizon of what we think is possible. If somebody tries to conceptualize an environment that doesn't look like the one that we have, or behaviors that aren't like the ones that we value, people that are within any given social system can't really conceive of those alternatives a lot of the time. Or rather, I'm not saying that nobody can, but a lot of the time people struggle with it. And I'm sure anybody who's listening to this, who's tried to discuss these topics with the average person, will have recognized how much people struggle with conceptualizing alternatives. You can sit there and describe and describe and describe the alternative, and then they'll say something that just clearly demonstrates that they weren't really following what you were saying, or they didn't fully absorb it because it was too different from what they conceptualize. There's another theory of this which I utilize in my work. Bickler and Nitzen, who are two economists, modern economists, have this concept that they call Cree order, and Cree order is kind of the same thing. It's the process by which any given system, both it reproduces itself but also changes in order to maintain itself. So this is a dynamic, continual process that, like Marx is talking about in social reproduction, is sort of taking place at every juncture. So we are conditioned by the systems that we're within. That is, I think when you describe what's happening with bonobos and chimpanzees, that's another good example. In fact, what I often go to when I talk to people about this subject, often what they'll say is like they'll make like appeals to human nature. They'll say stuff about human nature, like humans just aren't good enough for the different system. You know, we suck. You know, we're just inherently competitive and dominating creatures. Which, of course, you could use examples of human societies to demonstrate otherwise, but I often talk about baboons, as weird as that might sound, because there is this specific story about a troop of baboons. So there's a famous primatologist named Robert Sapolsky. I don't know if you've
I was
heard.
just gonna mention his name.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen those studies. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, no, it's an intriguing study. I love this baboon study because it demonstrates a lot, right? So baboons are generally considered to be one of the most brutish and domination hierarchy sort of primates that there are. Right? They're not like our closest cousin, but they're close enough to be considered here, right? For us to talk about it. And generally, it had been considered for a very long time that that domination hierarchy must be genetic because it's just so prevalent. Like pretty much any troop you go look at, it's like the dominant males are cruel and abusive and violent, and they kill the weaker males sometimes when they get out of line. Like it's really bad. Well, Robert Sapolsky is primatologist early on in his career. I think it was his graduate research project or something like that. Don't quote me on that part, but very early in his research career, he essentially wants to just go observe a troop of baboons, and he stakes out this claim, watching this group of baboons. And, they function like any troop of baboons you might expect, and he's paying attention to them. But what happens, and this is what throws it all into disarray, is that nearby there are humans, and those humans are discarding their meat, like leftover meat. Well, the thing is that there's a tuberculosis outbreak at this time. And so all of the meat is infected with tuberculosis. And here's the thing, in a dominance hierarchy, you know who gets all the meat first? The very top of the hierarchy, right? So at the very, very top of the hierarchy, they are the ones who get all the food first. They get the best pickings first. So there's this huge mound of tuberculosis meat, and all of the dominant males go and start eating tuberculosis meat. Well, obviously, I can summarize here. You know what's going to happen. All the dominant males are going to die of tuberculosis, right? And that's exactly what does happen. So Robert Sapolsky watches as the dynamics of this troop of baboons just radically changes. They start acting like bonobo monkeys. The women now have like more of I wouldn't say dominant position, but more of a prevalent position within the community. Conflicts stop being solved by violence, and they start being solved by grooming behaviors, which is usually indicative of more cooperative sort of primates. And it's funny because Sapolsky retells this story, and he talks about how he was deeply, deeply depressed and disappointed by this because he's just a researcher. He just wants to study the baboons and publish a paper, right? Like this screws up his whole study. Like he's just like, wow, well, I don't know what I do about this. Like this just screwed my entire study up. Literally, he sticks around for a little while and then he dips. He literally like leaves the country. Okay, so that part's pretty interesting, but it gets more interesting. He comes back years later to see what's happening with the troop. And he's astonished to find that the troop is still functioning this way. Like after all these years have passed, the troop's behaviors are still basically like they're like baboons acting like bonobos. And so, I've talked to people about this before, and here sometimes people object. They're like, yeah, well, you all the people who were genetically dominant, all the baboons that were genetically more dominant got selected out, and you got the more peaceful ones. What's mind blowing about that? It's kind of expected. But no, no. Here's the most interesting part. Almost no original members of that baboon troop remained. They had almost shifted out their entire population in the meantime, and yet they had maintained that behavior. And get this, it's not just them having babies that acted like that. It was actually that baboons from outside the troop had come into the troop and had been conditioned into the new social norms of the troop. That's to say, baboons who came from places where there were dominance hierarchies and they had been conditioned to those dominance hierarchies. Okay. And furthermore, there had been no genetic preening to kill all the dominant males, came to this troop and were conditioned by this troop to follow these new cooperative social norms. And so this demonstrates that it was not a genetic influence, that this was a social influence within the baboons. And I bring this story up because sometimes when I tell the story, when people are talking about human nature, what I say is, do you think we are less adaptable than baboons?
Really, that's what I was thinking, man. Is like the points you brought up. Maybe one of them is like, man, it's embarrassing that baboons do it better than us. They can actually organize and actually just think about things, given the fact that they have no technology. Look how they do it, And in our world, yeah, I mean, you make some. I mean, first of all, I love that story. I know about it because I've watched a little mini documentary on it. And Sapolsky, I learned about Sapolsky by watching Zeitgeist moving forward. A huge part of my education comes from like just literally watching Zeitgeist documentaries, all three of them, and then looking at all the information that Peter put into those documentaries. I thought they were a wealth of knowledge. So I read all their books, and I went, after all their works. I might be interviewing, who knows, James Gilligan maybe soon. He's working in New York City. But Sapolsky, his work, yeah. And to add on that, he would take the blood measurements, they would tranquilize the baboons and take the blood measurements of them to see the stress hormone levels in their blood. And he found more stress hormone levels in the baboons in the lower of the hierarchy, which it comes to a central point of mine. And I'm sure you agree, is the systems-based behavioral analysis of human behavior, like looking at behavioral science to determine laws basically for society. Like, what do we know is the most objective way to bring it about, like a rule structure, not something like rigid, but something that can be used relatively for society at large, in that, egalitarianism is good, obviously, and that people just function better. They're better at innovating, better at working, better at being healthy humans when there's just less hierarchy in general. It is a very frightening thing that we look at humanity, given how adaptive we can be in our thought processes, in our values. Wow, what an oppressive hegemonic system capitalism is, that talking about that, right, with baboons being able to transition to a better, more sustainable society. Right now, it seems things seem so damn far from that for humanity. And then looking at America, looking at duality between people who on both sides are so completely ignorant of what's happening. The Democrats, Republicans in America, all the tribalism and the group division that happens in the world, it can all be solved so much if we just simply ask relevant questions. How do you think we can transition, given the fact that capitalism is so hegemonic? I personally think anarchism is a good transition phase to arriving at a more sustainable society that actually uses the scientific method and modern technology to manage society in a more intelligent way. Anarchism, I feel like, is a really important thing. Mutual aid, things of that nature. Give us a little bit of the breakdown of the historical successes of anarchism, some relevant, really important ones. I know about the Spanish Revolution. You can break that down perhaps, but not only those historical successes and how we can use them for inspiration, and then use them as a kind of a loose guidebook for how we can bring about these kind of changes in today's society, which is becoming more polarized.
So I guess kind of like the first thing that I would note here is that there are a bunch of different theories of change within the body of anarchist theory. Like there's a lot of different anarchists that think a lot of different things. I'll kind of say that where I settle is on a topic called prefiguration. So prefiguration is the idea that you are building the new in the shell of the old. You're trying to build existing copies of things that are as much like the future world you want to see as is conceivably possible within the world that currently exists. And I emphasize that part about as is conceivably possible because obviously there are going to be limitations. We're not going to be able to just create perfect copies of what we want to see in the future. We are surrounded, as you say, by a hegemonic and colonial system, which enforces itself not only through that concept of like Cree order that we discussed a minute ago, but like you also note through out and out colonial violence, right? Like look at what's happening in Lebanon right now. That's a
Yeah.
whole other topic, but it's just a demonstration, right? That this system is always expansionist. It is brutal in maintaining its own desires and so on. Prefiguration is basically we're building the alternative here and now, and that means we have to build like all aspects of that alternative. One of the aspects is going to be the capability for self-defense, but that is part of the story. I think a lot of people, when they think about revolution, they're thinking about what maybe you would call like capital R revolution, which is to say like you arm everybody, you get a huge mass of people together, and then they overthrow the government in a coup. And maybe there's this like period of civil conflict that precedes the coup, right? Um, that I'm not saying that at some point that might not happen, but that's not the goal. That in fact has a pretty bad track record. And I'll explain why I think that it has a bad track record. It's mostly because in order for that to be successful, the alternative has to be powerful enough to sustain itself after you've defeated the old system. If when you go and overthrow the old system, you don't have the alternative in place, what you'll tend to find is that, well, you got to feed people. People have to have some means of sustaining themselves. You have to find ways to maintain your infrastructure. You have to find ways to do all the things, right? And generally, what you find is that, well, you're going to be using all the infrastructure, all of the structures and systems of the old world in order to do that, because you just got to do it. You can't just be like screwing around while people are starving. So if your alternative wasn't prefigured far enough, then you end up just reproducing capitalism all over again because the infrastructure of capitalism is all that's in place and you just have to do that. In my opinion, that's a big part of what happened in the USSR and Maoist China, for example, is that they just did a coup, and then the system just had to basically reproduce capitalism. The USSR is a little more complicated. They had more prefiguration, but that's a much bigger topic to discuss. I'll leave that to the side for now. So what the anarchist is basically saying is start building now. Like stop fetishizing the glorious revolution standing upon the hill with the sun behind our backs as our enemies stand in the valley. Like that stuff is kind of, I don't want to say it's LARPing because once again, maybe in some possible future that will be something that happens, but it will happen only if we're doing it right. It will only happen as the result of our alternative becoming so powerful that it is now an existential threat to the system that exists. So that means that that's a long ways off, y'all. I'm part of a group called Cooperation Tulsa, where we're trying to do prefiguration, right? We're building social structures. We have land that we're establishing, an agricultural cooperative on, and so on and so on and so on. Let me tell y'all, it's hard work. It's not going to happen in a short period of time. Prefiguration is hard work. I also want to emphasize, because, your original question was pretty broad, that there have been a lot of different approaches. So the earliest anarchist approaches were what were called propaganda of the deed, which was essentially big, glorious acts of violence, assassinating heads of state, bombing factories, the stuff that anarchists are kind of like stereotypically associated with. Like that is actually kind of what was going on in the early history of anarchism.
Well, you know what I call it? I call that stuff like all the Hollywood propaganda loves those kind of things. It's like that's what want to label anarchism. Oh, that's what anarchism is. Just don't forget, it's throwing Molotov cocktails at people's houses. That's what anarchism at the government buildings. So
There was a time when it was. There was a time when that
Yeah.
was the dominant means of anarchism, to be honest. Like, I would say kind of late 1800s. Yeah, yeah, pretty much late 1800s. It kind of started to shift around the late 1800s as a lot of anarchists saw it wasn't working, right? Basically what would happen is some of the greatest organizationalist anarchists who we now recognize at the time, what they would do is they were just all about like going out and trying to get people to rebel with arms. Like they would just get a bunch of guns, go out into the countrysides, be like, hey, who wants to rebel? And then they'd get like a handful of people and they'd try some pointless rebellion that didn't work, right? And that led to anarchists starting to take more of an approach about mass movements, and for them getting more involved in the union movement and building union federations and trade union federations and so on, which gave us the foundations of a lot of the stuff the anarchists built in the early 1900s. So that kind of leads me now. That leads me now to like the C&T FAI in the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War, most people really aren't very familiar with it, but it took place before World War II. Sometimes it's been called like the dress rehearsal for World War II. And it was essentially a civil conflict that was carried out because Franco, a fascist, wanted to do a coup of the Spanish Republic. However, the reason why it turned into a civil war was not just because of that one-way fight between Franco and the Spanish Republic. It was because also at the same time, there was an enormous federation of anarchists called the C&T FAI. And that was two different federations itself joined together, the C&T and the FAI. And these were two different anarchist federations. By the time it happened, they had already established a ton of trade unions, already established, militias and federations of militias, and they had armories ready to go and all of this stuff. But I would say what they were lacking was deeper prefiguration, making determinations about like council structures. They didn't have like a lot of these like kind of civil council bodies where they could get people together to make decisions. Most of their decisions were economic in nature. They were based around protests and strikes, but they didn't necessarily have as much based around everybody coming together and making all of the decisions together in big assemblies and all of that. It did happen. I'm not trying to pretend it didn't. It did. But it wasn't like that mechanism wasn't as well developed as their mechanisms for economic warfare, you might say. So they ended up, skipping forward in the story, they ended up forming an extremely proficient response to the incursion of fascism in Spain. And that's why the Spanish Civil War was kind of a three-way civil war. You basically had the Spanish Republic on one side, you had Franco on the other, and you had the anarchists. And the anarchists claimed entire regions of Spain and collectivized massive portions of land and got all of the landowners together to make decisions and mobilized an entire army to fight
So
Franco.
generally, like, how many people we're talking about here,
It's
roughly?
honestly, I've had a really hard time getting kind of like a clear, good estimate. But as far as I can see, the estimate should probably be put at somewhere around 2 million people. But I should also mention that it was highly successful. It was actually more
Yeah.
productive than what came before it. They almost like instantly, within just a year or two, mobilized an entire war effort. They built armored vehicles. They got arms to enormous numbers of people. The food, and by the way, I think one of the most interesting parts is that they had kind of a dual model where in the cities, almost the entire economy was worker cooperatives. So they hadn't eliminated the market. They were still like trading and selling things and so on and producing things as commodities. But all of the economy was essentially owned by the workers because it had been seized during the beginning of the conflict. That's interesting. But I think what's also interesting is out in the countrysides, they had essentially decommodified agriculture. So there was like, essentially you didn't pay for food. Everybody just got food directly distributed. And they got food to the front lines when sometimes even Franco's troops were starving on the front lines. So like, it was an enormous success. It was a glorious, rollicking success for the anarchists. But there were a few problems. Number one, the Bolsheviks didn't side with the anarchists. The Bolsheviks sided with the Spanish government. And meanwhile, Hitler was backing Franco. And so what you had essentially was the anarchists just having to make a go of it with their own stick-to-itiveness and their own productive capacities, whereas their enemies were being bankrolled by foreign entities, right?
Wait, that's amazing. Before we continue on that, I just had a question. Well, I wanted to tell the people who are hearing this, like, people need to understand, because there's such a huge dismissal of there being hope for the future as far as change goes. Because people say, oh, whenever you add a certain number of people, beyond, I don't know, a couple thousand or whatever, people just become chaotically and are, hierarchical and competitive, and all that shit just comes out of them. Like, you know how they always say that kind of stuff, like, oh, China's a huge country, that's why it's competitive and all this stuff. And numbers, once there's a certain number of people, it becomes unmanageable, and you just it breaks into, it's a completely absurd argument, but that's what they say. And it's like, no, here we are talking about 2 million people who lived very much counter to the cultural and economic normalities of capitalist culture, which is, commodification, strict hierarchy, mass advertisement, artificial demand, creating all kinds of neuroses in people, all the wealth inequality and competing for jobs and growth and, labor for income and all these things that we take for granted, like just normality of life, like seems to be nothing beyond that. But that's how people were organizing back then. And like you said, it's such a counter to the way normally are done in business as usual in the world, that it was like the one thing they could unify against, right, the fascists, the communists, and the capitalists was this, right?
Yeah,
What do you think?
absolutely. And going to this is maybe a good transition into some broader points of our discussion. But when people really ask me about the successes of anarchism, often I don't even point them to things which are explicitly anarchist. And that's because I don't really care whether the thing is called anarchist or not. Like that doesn't matter to me personally. What I want to see is horizontal power structures succeeding. I want to see horizontal power structures by any name succeeding across the planet in different conditions, trying to prefigure an alternative society. So often when people are asking me for examples of success, I'm pointing to modern examples such as the Zapatistas, or to Rojava to some degree, or some even more obscure examples like Fejuve or Sika Sosola. These are all examples of horizontal power structures scaling very, very large, right? The Zapatistas are like 300,000 people, we imagine. It seems like that Rojava is probably around 3 million. Then you've got,
Wow, really?
yeah,
3 million.
Rojava is
That's in
huge.
Syria, right? Syria?
Northeast Syria, yes. Yeah.
Interesting.
And so all of these examples demonstrate that horizontal power structures can work, and that they can span large, and that they can coordinate large amounts of stuff. And these are the sorts of examples that I look to in the modern day. The CNT FAI was really important for my radicalization, to learn about it, to be like, to know that, wow, it can work under the right circumstances, and to learn a lot from what they did right and wrong. But in the modern day, I find myself mostly focusing around these other examples, which don't even call themselves anarchist, but themselves demonstrate the successes of horizontal power structures.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing us to this transition point, because I wanted to move on to this other topic. Um, I mean, you helped us with the idea of prefiguration, because the anarchists, the reason why the past ones failed, like you said, they didn't do enough prefiguration, because we are not of the type to be like, oh, let's just wait society to collapse and then we're gonna just put things together, because that's just, I heard that it's just like, I have to say, I accuse myself of being like that a little bit. Like 10 years ago, I was like, oh yeah, let Trump win. That's just because he'll just expose the system for more shitty it is to the people out there. But look, he's become popular, and look what happened. He's made things worse. He's made people's understanding capabilities worse than it used to be, with the whole fake news phenomenon, all this nonsense. And so it's extremely dangerous. We have to do what we can within the system to minimize the harm being done, to control the vicious, and externalities of the system. Trump is an externality of the system. At the same time, we have to be planning for prefiguration. As things collapse, we have to be actually working on projects like community building of the shared unified worldview, shared values. So not only the social aspect of it, but also the like architectural skeletal structure of the things we're talking about, like, okay, at some point people have to figure out a way to get, if the industrial system falls, the supply chain fails, have some way in the future, foreseeable future, food production, access to manufacturing, proper transportation, things of that nature that the capital system pretty much has control over, really, over our lives. And that's why the whole argument of, if you don't like the iPhone, get something else is like ridiculous. Like, no, they have control over the means of the whole thing. So we need prefiguration, creating the alternative. Okay. So before the collapse, and actually it's interesting because, the previous interview I did, I was part of the discussion with Zach, the Venus Project, and Simon Michel. So what you were mentioning before about proper like accounting, for the things we're doing, not just being impulsive, right? Like, I'm just going to overthrow the system, and then we're just going to be like, wait, what do we have in our hands right now? So the plan of the future, we talked to Simon, and Simon, is brilliant geologist who really did all the hard work, how he did all the accounting. Okay, like, how do we actually do the physical bare bones energy transition away from fossil fuels to something more sustainable? And I mean, it's a very massive equation, really, and like, you coming from your background, right? Your understanding of physics and the respect we need to have as a society for systems thinking. Tell us, like, what are some important steps and examples you see right now in the world happening that we can actually use as, a roadmap of how to transition beyond this?
Yeah, well, I think the four examples that I gave are pretty important because they're kind of all in different circumstances and they're doing it slightly different. So the Zapatistas are often the first one that I'll discuss. That's about 300,000 people. They're in Chiapas, Mexico. It's not the entire region of Chiapas, but it's a pretty hefty chunk of the region of Chiapas. And their entire society is essentially managed by a series of local councils where the people come together and make decision in big assemblies, and they rotate people through these positions within the councils, and they determine almost all of the policy in their society. And
And I'm sorry to cut you off, but like, if you were to ask the Zapatista what they are, what would they tell you as far as their like political, affiliation or whatever? What are they aligned with?
I think that if you ask them, most of them would just say they're indigenous Mayans. I think that's the dead truth of
Great.
it. I think that
Okay. Okay. Good.
I don't think that they would probably like identify as Marxist. They wouldn't identify as anarchist. They probably,
Yeah.
the only name that I've ever seen them kind of like solidly give to their ideology is Neo-Zapatismo. But even then, Neo-Zapatismo is a mixture of a bunch of different underlying currents. It's like a mixture of indigenous Mayan ideology, Catholic liberation theology, some amount of like Maoism, anarchism, especially like anarcho-syndicalism had some influence from a long time ago. And these things kind of all are smashed together there in their region. If I had to say, though, I think that it was probably indigenous Mayan values that seem to really be front and center in what they're doing. It just turns out that when you look at indigenous values, they often look very anarchic. They wouldn't maybe necessarily call them anarchist because it's that's like a specific body of theory, but it's very anarchic. Right, like it's like like there's a reason why anarchists are so sympathetic to indigenous resistance movements and the history of indigenous
Of
society. It's
course.
because they were generally much more horizontal. Not all of them, obviously. There was a mixture, but a lot of them were more horizontal. So the Zapatistas are a pretty good example. Um, then you've got Rojava. Rojava is taking place in northeast Syria in the middle of a civil conflict between a variety of different actors that have been in and out of that civil conflict. But it's essentially a Kurdish national liberation movement, I think probably would be the best way to characterize it. But it is the leader, Abdullah Öcalan, was deeply influenced by the anarchist theorist Murray Bookchin, who later
Wow.
called
Interesting.
himself a communalist, not an anarchist. But I think communalism is very close to anarchism. It has some relatively minor differences that they appear
Sure.
major to anarchists, but from the outside are very minor. Abdullah Öcalan was imprisoned by the Turkish state. And while he was in prison, he read Bookchin, and it utterly transformed his thinking. Beforehand, he was basically like a Maoist vanguardist. He was the head of a group called the PKK, and uh, afterwards he was deeply transformed to instead recognize that the state was bad, that you had to somehow create a civic society from the bottom up, and the Kurdish liberation movement became essentially a communalist revolutionary movement and occupied northeastern Syria during the civil conflict, and still remains there to this point. Currently, their main threat is actually not the Syrian government, although the Syrian government is complicit in a lot of what's taking place. It's actually Turkey, who is doing incursion into the eastern part of Syria and is literally like burning crops and stuff.
So Erdogan's completely full of shit then when he's talking about Palestine and stuff.
Yeah, honestly, I can't
'Cause
imagine
I
he
mean, what a
actually.
hypocrite! He's doing literally what Israel's doing. You know?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. He has no principled opposition to colonialism, obviously.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I think it's mostly just
Um,
geopolitical posturing.
and so like, I actually want to ask, like, what as the system collapses, I mean, I'm sure you agree that the system is the foreseeable future for capitalism globally is not looking bright. Even the BRICS don't have the future panned out and organized. You know, it's going to be chaotic and destructive. And as things collapse, do you feel that there is a big threat of overthrow or control of these indigenous, you know, alternative societal things that are happening, like Rojava? Um, and what, yes, I mean, do we have self defense? Sure. But also, I feel like maybe there's also point B. Can the world just see that other examples are working better as our society is falling apart and then try to adopt those as well, becoming adaptive to what's happening around the world and learning to create their own alternatives. But yeah, what do you think?
I think that no state is going to do that. I think
Yeah,
that
no state's gonna do that. Yeah,
yeah.
I agree.
But you may
Hmm.
see as these projects continue that more and more people are going to be inspired from the bottom up to begin doing this sort of prefiguration, to begin creating the conditions to seize the vacuums. Because here's the thing: I'm not. Uh, I should put it the right way. The system, I don't believe that the system is going to collapse under its own weight, but I do believe that it will have a series of ruptures wherein
Yeah,
there
for
will be
sure.
vacuums. And then,
Yeah, I agree. It's not like one day we run around with our heads cut off, like on fire.
yeah,
It's going to be a bunch of systemic failures over time, as like really is sadly. I think that's more dangerous than just a fat sudden collapse because people
yeah,
become acclimated to lowering and lowering conditions of life and things of that nature. Like I mean, I live in New York, in Brooklyn, New York. Man, I remember when I first came to America from Iran. Plenty of snow during winters, up to your knees snow. You make a snowman, you make an igloo. Every winter, I was looking forward to that. And now I'm like, I tell people, I'm like, do you guys realize no one's complaining about this other than me? That there's literally no more snow in New York.
mm,
We're lucky to get a little bit, and it's usually like just very icy. It deteriorates quickly, But like, that's the danger of capitalism, in that the conditions are for worsening. So you're just gonna have a bigger circle. People on the very outside of, like, unfortunately, like people, let's say, living in Palestine are on the very, very outer end of the systems of suffering and what you're exposed to on the true face of the system. They're experiencing the true face of this vicious system. And then, the animals going extinct. Then you move in a little circle. Okay, now like the lower classes of, let's say, in America, people are very big poverty, homeless or whatnot. Then you move to middle class, upper class, like people are more secure, have more of a cushion, safety net to not be hurt by the system. But like what's happening is we're like slowly being forced to accept the closing walls, as things get worse, and we just accept, oh, climate change is just, yeah, we did it. Yeah, I mean, that's just the natural trajectory of things. So yeah, I'm sorry to rant so much, but the point was that it's not going to be some one quick collapse. No, there's going to be a series of progressive failures. And how do we prepare ourselves for that? Because I do agree with you. We have to, I think, build our own communities, anywhere we can. And then hopefully in the future, like Simon talked about with the system, somebody puts up together a really good version of it where we have good technology and energy capacity, and then we can duplicate it and, like, just, I guess, outsource it right to the rest of the world.
yeah. No, I would
Yeah, what
tend
are
to
your thoughts?
agree. The way I look at it is the system is probably going to maintain itself in more and more draconian ways the worse things get. right? As you say, the true
Yeah.
face will be shown more and more and more. Because it will have less and less luxury to kind of sit back and give us some of the spoils, right? It'll have to give us less and less of the spoils. But as you say, the terrifying thing is us being like boiled frogs, like slowly things getting worse and not recognizing what's happening until we're already dying. But I think that what's going to happen is, once again, there will be ruptures. Things will get bad enough that things will explode, and then there will be vacuums. And what we need to do is, when the vacuums come, we need to have things that are robust, that are ready to go, right? We need to have systems that are prepared to survive in the vacuum. And I think that really emphasizes is the need to make things that are self-perpetuating over long periods of time.
Exactly.
And I think one of the failures of the movement historically, of anarchist movement historically, has been this emphasis on temporary structures, this desire to make these spontaneous structures that pop up and do a task and disappear, and then pop up and do a task and disappear. I think that has utterly failed. We essentially have built no power because of it. And it's not going to do anything when the time comes when these ruptures arrive. And, our enemies have robust structures of command and logistics. And we're over here like, well, I know how to, cook food. And it's like, well, that's great. But like, do you know the logistics of distributing that food to large numbers of people? What if we got you 100 cooks? Would you know how to actually feed, 10,000 people? And the answer is at current, for the most part, no. And you only
Yep.
learn those things by surviving for long enough to learn. You have to stick around. You have to develop an institutional memory, and you have to grow and grow and grow your capacities over time. That's the only way we're going to be prepared to deal with these ruptures. So that's why, for me, prefiguration is so important, and why I don't advocate this informal, spontaneous, temporary method or approach.
Yeah, I agree. Like, we have to create feedback mechanisms and feedback loops that can slowly pull us in a different direction in certain areas around the world. I have the two books actually here. I was going to show them, like, the New Human Rights Movement book by Peter Joseph, which breaks down, like, just in simple language, which is easy. It should be easy to understand the 5 economic transitions that we should make when it comes to instituting policy to reduce the harm being done, but also when it comes to just enabling us to have a more smooth transition, right? So if we're creating communities, we would kind of want to, on a micro and macro level, in terms of our behavior and the institutions that we create to sustain them and perpetuate them, adopt certain values. There should be no aggressive pursuit of making sure people just have a job where they're getting paid for things. People do smart work, intelligent work that's actually needed. And then we try to reduce the oppressive nature of work, of arduous, dangerous, repetitive, dirty work, and try to assign that to technology like machines. So, transitioning on an institutional and personal level for like, which actually reduces hierarchy anyway, right? Labor for income to access-based societies where we automate work and we eliminate private property, right? Which is just not only removing oppression, but also just more efficient. Access systems where people have access to resources for their utility they use much less resources, right? They're much easier to have access to. You create like tools libraries, things of that nature. And then the other points, like, trying to move away from globalization as much as we can to localization. And then when we look at the rule structure, like the values, I like the book by David Graeber. I'm sure you read of it, The Utopia of Rules. You heard of that book?
Yeah, I have. Actually, that's one of his works I have not read, however.
Oh, okay. I actually have it with me, but like I haven't read the whole thing either. I've read only parts of it, and I actually looked at a short Instagram video that was really brilliant, quickly summarized the book for me. So I'm like, okay. It just talks about, like, yeah, if you get rid of all these ridiculous abstractions and like you said before previously, these very simplistic assumptions that we make, trying to reduce the complexity of the universe to simple assumptions that we force down people's throats, like human nature is to be greedy, hierarchy works best, competition creates innovation, all these kind of ridiculous statements that are all false, provably through tremendous evidence in literature, scientific literature. David Graeber says, like, when we remove these like forced abstractions, people actually do have the capacity to think logically and rationally, get down together and create the right rule structures, like just like the baboons and the bonobos did. I'm sure we can figure that out, given the fact that we have an enormous amount of scientific, social science literature, as well as like just the technology taking off today as far as what we can do on a lo-fi level, infrastructure wise, is incredible. The things that we can come up with. So yeah, like please like elaborate a little more on that. Like what are some things we can be doing right now? Like the average person listening to this, and I come across a lot of people where like there is no real strict plan on how we can make a transition. What are some things that we could, like very simple things that we can be advocating for right now?
So I think the challenge is that it's sometimes hard to articulate the strategy in terms of tactics, right? Like we can see the strategy to some degree, but it's sometimes hard to like bring it down to earth for any given specific person. But I'll kind of describe some of the ways that I've come about the topic. One is I talk about what I call the four pillars of prefiguration. So I say that basically there are like four broad categories of things that we have to establish all of them, but that most people are only really going to participate in one or two of these. And they're basically what I would call councils, which are bodies where we come together, make decisions, where you might call them democratic or consensus processes take place. We deliberate, we decide together, and then we implement together. Right? These are you might call these I call these councils, just more broadly. Right? It's a class of things. The second is economics. We need horizontal economics. Well, that means we're probably going to have worker cooperatives. We're going to have collectives. We're probably going to have some things that kind of look like communes. We're going to have a variety of these sort of economic bodies and mechanisms by which we can distribute economic resources, and that also includes things like mutual aid networks and direct distribution networks and things like that. Those are also forms of economics. We're also going to need defense. Defense is to say our capability of defending ourselves. And that means both in the traditional sense you might imagine, which is to say the ability to do violence and self-defense, but also the just things like harm reduction and taking care of people in our community. Those are forms of defense, right? Like that is defending our community. And the fourth one is intelligence. That is to say, we need to have sophisticated apparatuses for learning things. And that includes learning things about our enemies. That includes just educational processes more broadly. That does include things like doing spy work, which people need to be able to kind of spy on the enemy. That includes doing things like being information clearinghouses, like WikiLeaks, for example, which is not particularly horizontal, but regardless. But all of these are going to be necessary, and all of them are going to have to be created, maybe not necessarily all by themselves, but they're all going to have to be part of the process, and then they're all going to have to be linked up together into big networks such that we will actually be able to prefigure something that can survive. Because if we only do one of those and we forget the other three, or even if we just do two and forget the other two, or we do three and forget the last one, something will go wrong. Like you can't leave any of them out. You need all four pillars. They don't all have to be within the same organization, but you will need them within every kind of distinct iteration of the movement. So you as a person, when I'm talking to, whoever's listening, you should ask yourself, where do you slot into those four pillars? Which of those do you have some proficiency that you believe you are capable of doing? Do you feel like you're a good community organizer? You're probably going to be best suited to like council building and general assemblies and getting people together in big meetings and stuff and being a coordinator. If you're like a businessman, or you know how to do business, but you're kind of like, not happy about capitalism and you don't really want to form a corporation, but damn, you know how to run a business, you know how this stuff works, then why don't you should start trying to make worker cooperatives. You should help a bunch of people get together and make a functioning worker cooperative, right? Like, ask yourself what your skill set is, and then ask yourself how it can be applied, because we're basically going to need every kind of skill set to do this.
We're talking about complex and dynamic systems that need, a culture that has to emerge that has variability, able to deal with stressors and the unpredictable unfolding of the world around us, because things are not predictable on any level, especially given the situation at hand, with the socioeconomic system we have today, which is just like conflict bound. Let's like talk a little bit about let's shit a little bit on these uh authoritarian leftists,
Mhm.
because I want to talk about like what not to do. How about like I was part of the RCA, and um, yeah, please like break down a little bit of where they where they're flawed in their way of thinking, because they were talking a lot of smack about anarchism.
Mm.
They're like, they're talking about the Paris Commune, how it was like not structured enough to fight back against the violence of the state, and how we need a state because we need to have a state structure to make sure that we make the transition in the end. And how, oh yeah, like overall, like authoritarian leftism. What you called it. You actually introduced me to that term. I wasn't calling it that before, but now it's part of my lingo. Authoritarian leftism. Uh,
Yeah.
what? Yeah, yeah. Why they're flawed in so many other things that they that they espouse.
Yeah, I mean, I could comment on numerous of the things you brought up there. I think probably a good place to start is just kind of like where it all came from. It should be said that Marx and Engels did distribute or did demonstrate some of the early tendencies of authoritarian leftism. But I think if you were to compare them to what came after them, looking at people like Lenin and Stalin and Mao and so on, that those would not be very demonstrative of their actual views, of Marx and Engels' actual views. I think that they would have probably condemned those people in practice. Um, if you look at Lenin, for example, because Lenin's kind of the origination point of this, Lenin is advocating something that really has almost nothing in common with what Marx and Engels wanted, and had more in common with two thinkers, and that was Blanqui, who was maybe the earliest vanguardist, and Lassalle, who was somebody who believed that the state could transform itself into an alternative version, right? And so essentially that's like the foundations of a vanguardist mentality. It's the idea that you have some small elite group of people who themselves are the highest manifestation of the proletariat consciousness and should themselves then be the leaders and commanders of the movement. And so Lenin essentially conceived of the Bolsheviks as being this vanguard and as being the manifestation of proletarian consciousness, and therefore kind of quote unquote representing the proletariat. And therefore, whatever the vanguard does, that's for the proletariat. It is the proletariat doing those things, is the way they like to make it out to be. Interestingly, Trotsky was the one who critiqued this early on. He called it substitutionism. You substitute the
Hmm.
people for the party, and then
Mhm.
you substitute the party for the dictator, and so on, right? Uh,
Interesting.
and that actually is where the flaw of their ideology is. It is this sort of idealist substitution where all at once you have like an entire body of people with all their complex desires, with all their wants and the things that they need. And then somehow it's now quote unquote represented by a very small group of people, most of the time people who are not even themselves laborers, but instead come from either more petite bourgeois backgrounds, sometimes literally bourgeois backgrounds, or at minimum themselves kind of are like academics and or party or politicians, right? And these people then pretend that they quote unquote represent the masses in that sense. Obviously, they don't. This leads to simplification, as we discussed earlier in the podcast, and that leads to them therefore imposing their will through domination onto the people. And so what we see historically is that that method doesn't even work unless the people have already begun creating a movement well before that the vanguard has come about. So the vanguard method only works
Mhm.
if there's something to co-opt. And you can see this in
Got it.
every single protest movement. Look at every single protest movement. It's never started by the authoritarian leftists. They always jump into the driver's seat partway through. Like the George Floyd protests, they tried and failed because nobody wanted them to lead anything because they had nothing to do with it. Or the Palestine protests right now. Don't get me wrong, in some places I think that they were influential in helping those get off the ground, but in a bunch of places they had nothing to do with it. And the people themselves had started these protests and these occupations, and then the authoritarian leftists, their vanguards, tried to come in and take control, and people just kicked them out.
Hmm.
Their entire method, the entire vanguardist method, is co-option. It's not about actually creating anything. It's about
Oh,
taking
okay,
control.
interesting. Great you're pointing that up because in so many of their meetings, they were mentioning, by the way, they're like obsessed over Lenin. and they're like, oh, like, did you do your required reading before coming to the meeting? I'm like, man, uh, what do you call it? They're saying, oh, like Lenin's What to Do. Did you read this page of this thing before the meeting? It's like almost they're going by a very prefixed, script to run by, and then they're talking about all the time. Oh, when the revolution happens, when the thing does happen in the end, we're gonna come in and do this and that. They kept mentioning that, because, like you said, they're like, almost, I guess, opportunists in some way, right? I mean,
They
that
are.
can be
They're
classified as
opportunists.
that.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
It's funny because this phrase opportunism was always meant to refer to people who essentially just took advantage of the circumstances in order to gain personal power. And weirdly, the Bolsheviks always called other people opportunists, but they were the ultimate
Wow, wow.
opportunist,
It's
right?
projection.
Yeah, it's
You
absolute
know?
projection. Absolutely. And that's it remains to this day. It remains to this day. That's their method. And it's funny that they would recommend what is to be done. What is to be done is literally like some social democrat stuff. There's nothing revolutionary in what is to be done. It's literally like how to do parliamentary politics in monarchist Russia. Anybody who
Totally. Oh
recommends
my
anybody
god.
read that didn't read it. Like I don't it as there's nothing useful to gain from what is to be done.
I
Um,
was also part of the Democratic Socialists who are like all these, they obsess over AOC and stuff. Uh, is that in some way related to that? What you
I would
just
say
said?
honestly, what is to be done is more in line with like the DSA than some kind of like vanguardist Leninism, like what is to be done was literally written during a period of time where Lenin was mostly engaged in like electoral politics and stuff, not as like being some kind of, revolutionary or something. But yeah, it's funny that people even recommend it. It's for me, it's more of a historical document than anything important that anybody should read. Even vanguardists, I don't think it's very helpful for them. But yeah, so then what happens? They essentially just have an ideology of co-option, which was really only built to work in societies that were undergoing a transition from feudalism to capitalism. So if you look at all of the times where this vanguardism worked, it was in societies that had not fully undergone the transition into capitalism. They still kind of had some of these remnants of either monarchism or some form of extremely despotic nationalism that had not yet fully embraced like a capitalist model of social organization. And then the vanguard essentially like hijacks a revolution which ostensibly could have been socialist, and instead they push it into reproducing capitalism. And so, in a way, it actually means that the vanguardists of the modern day couldn't even do what they wanted to do because these aren't those conditions. We don't live in a feudal society or a society holding on to the vestiges of monarchism or some kind of despotic nationalist government. We live in capitalism. So their vanguardism is never going to work. It's built for other conditions to begin with. But their
Like
main
you said
danger,
before, I'm sorry. Like you said before, the prefiguration is missing anyway.
yeah, it wouldn't
They
even
don't
work
have the capacity.
precisely. And so
Sorry to cut
they're
you off.
not a danger probably insofar as that they're going to be able to create state capitalism, because I doubt they're capable of actually doing that. We already live in capitalism, so there's really no need, nor would they do anything special if they got power. It's instead that they're a danger insofar as that they dupe so many people into something that's not doing anything and it's not going to work. And all it does is it trains people who would maybe otherwise be very well educated and well intentioned radicals to be co-opters and opportunists who just try to hijack things that they had nothing to do with and take control over movements that have potential and destroy them by constraining them to the straitjacket of their dead-end, outdated ideology. And they're just going to keep doing it. They're going to keep doing it over and over and over. The only solution is literally to exclude them from our spaces. It sounds mean, but it's just kind of what it boils down to. And at minimum, they have to be excluded from organizing spaces. But I would say in an interpersonal sense, it's like whatever. Who your friend is up to you, I guess.
Sure, sure.
You know,
No, I get what you mean. Like I've had for like certain things we have to understand. Okay, if people want a better world and actually willing to work towards it, I guess certain things we have to kind of like let slip and work with each other of that nature. Like for example, if you're a vegan and you're like shaming a person who eats meat here and there, that they can't be part of the solution because they don't understand the horrible things that happen in the meat industry. Okay, sure, but that person, I mean, it just he's brought up in a culture through a system that has made him conditioned that way to anyway. So it's like, as long as they want the structural change in the future of a world beyond capitalism or whatnot, you know, then you work with them. But like what you said, it seems like authoritarian leftists are just hard because if it's when they have that much of a disposition towards hierarchy and those kind of domination kind of oriented tactics, it's almost as bad. Like, unless, yeah, I mean, we got to work with them. Anybody we can, if we can, but certain people, like I was telling my friend, my cousin actually earlier today, she's telling me, hey, listen, like you can make a Zionist understand, beyond capitalist stuff. I'm like, those are some of the hardest people I think to make understand about the evils of capitalism because they are literally a product of capitalism. Their culture is the most, a very rooted association with capitalism because it's colonial entity and it's actually, it's in Israel, they say, the next generation says, oh, if Arabs are the common cold, then leftist ideology is AIDS. So it's like, if people actually say that kind of crap, that is like very hard to work with. They have to first understand their existence and what it is represents first before they even come to the larger order systems understanding of the broader, context. And so, yeah,
Yeah, I think that
I guess, yeah,
what it really boils down to is that authoritarian leftists have internalized these very duplicitous, manipulative sorts of politics. So when they see something organically occurring that they don't have control of, they either want to infiltrate and learn everything about it, they want to destroy it, or they want to control it. And that's their only three approaches, right? So having them in your midst is almost just like inviting in the saboteur. It's inviting in the person who's going to try to destroy your organization, who's going to be constantly spying and reporting back to their vanguard, or who wants to try to take control of your organization, who wants to turn it into a front group or a feeder group of some kind. Idealistic Daniel of the past was all left unity and so on, where I thought you could work with these people. But in my experience, it's just not possible. We have completely different strategic imperatives, and inviting them in is inviting in saboteurs most of the time, in my experience.
got it. And so speaking of like the more important things, like which you mentioned, prefiguration. I want to actually talk about like when you talk about the state and how it leads to oppressive and just inefficient outcomes. Um, what do you think about? I want to talk about a few more historical examples, like the revolution in Chile, right, where Salvador Allende he tried to institute using Stafford beer and cybernetics, having like even back then it's crazy, right? For that time's technology, having a government, I guess a state. It's not like a really state in the conventional sense, but an apparatus that provides resources in an intelligent way, resource-wise, that can maintain itself, that has enough prefiguration to deal, like how the United States try to stop that. Obviously, they try to do a coup, and then they try to do the truckers' revolt, right? To stop the flow of resources, and somehow Salvador's system, whatever he worked out at that point, was able to take those blows and survive. That's why they had to eventually use the military and all that to overthrow it. But like, would that be I guess or labeled as a state kind of a thing that did that? I mean, Salvador wanted that to happen, but I don't think it's just one person. I'm sure there was enough of a social animus in that direction to want to get those things to happen. What would that be classified as? Like a state
Yeah,
organization?
no,
Or
I'd say it was a state. I think there are two examples that I know of where the state actually made earnest attempts to put socialism in place. And those are Chile, under Allende with the help of Stafford Beer, and Yugoslavia under Tito. Those are the only two examples that I know of where the state made real earnest attempts to create worker control, to create bottom up, direction of the economy. But unfortunately, if what you do is if you let the state be this sort of central clearinghouse of some sort or another, where the state apparatus is necessary, where it imposes regulation, where it itself has to exist for all of this to persist, you end up shooting yourself in the foot. The bottom up control is always sort of temporary, as to how long the state exists or how long the state continues to tolerate it. So in the example of Chile, if, for example, that it had actually been completely rooted to the bottom and the state had become sort of meaningless or unnecessary, then the coup wouldn't have done anything, right? The coup would have been meaningless because all the power would have been at the bottom. But unfortunately, the state did still have considerable power in Chile at that time, and they had not, like, divested power out of the state completely within Cybersyn. Um,
Oh,
and so,
interesting.
or you
So,
look
so
at
you're saying like, so you're saying like the fact that it went after the leadership and the head of the whole thing brought it down easier than it would have if it had a, like you said, a bottom up approach.
Yeah, exactly. Because what leader would you attack? There's no central node to destroy, right? This is actually one of the, like, coming from like an, I don't know, systems analysis or engineering perspective. In engineering, what you're supposed to do is you build out your system, then you go through and you catalog every conceivable failure point. Okay. You go through, you make a list of failure points, and then you also catalog their likelihood and how disastrous they would be if they took place. And then you basically do a risk assessment. You say, okay, this one's incredibly unlikely, but boy, oh boy, if it happened, it would be terrible. Oh man, if this one happened, the car would literally explode. It only happens like 1 out of 100,000 rides, but the car would explode. So what you're supposed to do as an engineer is you're supposed to do whatever you can to prevent the disastrous failure modes, right? If you look at centralized or authoritarian systems, they are built inherently with a disastrous failure mode. And that is, if the central node, if the place where all the power is concentrated is sabotaged, destroyed, replaced, undermined, etc., the whole system undergoes a disastrous failure. And that's the risk of concentration of power. Fundamentally, it cannot be avoided, because to avoid it, you would have to decentralize power. You would have to start distributing it. And in fact, if you just look at it from a systems thinker's perspective, this is actually what Stafford Beer tried to do. Stafford Beer came to Chile. Stafford Beer basically tried to create a system where, as much as is conceivable, the power was at the bottom. But, and I have to say, Allende seems like he was a brilliant man. I don't have any hatred for him. However, he was kind of insistent that there would always be some kind of like state interlocutors who were in the workplaces making sure that things went as the state wanted. And
Got it.
so there was still state influence in how the workplaces were being managed, number one. And number two, the regulator and the manager of the army and the manager of all the legislation was still the state. What you needed to do is all that needed to be decentralized as well. You needed to decentralize and federate militias to make your army. You needed to decentralize and federate your deliberation, your democratic bodies that make all of your policy and pass all of your regulations. That also needed to be distributed, because that's what allowed it to be that when they just cooed the government, that all at once now all that bottom up power meant nothing. You have to do it almost absolutely for it to matter. The same thing happened in Yugoslavia, by the way. So Tito did this. The Tito was like Allende, this person who his vision and his ideology was stronger than any desire for power, for his own power, right? Like he cared more about doing what needed to be done. And so Tito was basically a benevolent dictator, and he established a system where it was complete worker control from the bottom up, and almost everything in the economy was worker cooperatives and federations of worker cooperatives making decisions about the entire economy. It was awesome. Yugoslavia is very interesting, worth reading about. Basically what happened was Tito brought the whole country together. There had been a lot of like civic conflict beforehand, and he was like a figure that everybody respected and revered. And when Tito died, everything fell into chaos. And once again, disastrous failure mode. There's your disastrous failure mode again. So this is why sometimes it's been said, it's not about who sits on the throne, it's the throne itself, right?
Of course. I mean, that like, even when you come to like democracy, for example, in America, I often tell people it's not about people, it's about ideas. You're not electing a person as much as you're electing the ideas that person supposedly represents. I mean, don't even get us started on the ridiculousness dog and pony clown show of the presidential race, where like, it's like, oh, Trump is this, Kamala's that. Like, no, it's more like these people, like Obama, Biden, they represent the industries that support them, right? It's not just the person, right? It's the ideological framework of all the institutions and the industries that fund them to get up there and all that. So even that in and of itself is like, sure, it's the ideas that matter, not the people. And so going back to what you're talking about, making sure that we have enough prefiguration. That's why it's so much better to use systems thinking, like what Fresco talked about, Jacques Fresco. You have different levels of redundancy, like you talked about engineering, making sure that the society is stable enough that there can be an apparatus that's a management system of things on a global, but also should be on a local level. So there's local redundant safety measures put in place. So if something fails, there's things to step in right away. And I think we can do that right now with AI and computer technology and automation. There's so much incredible things we can do when it comes to just maintaining systems, production, distribution, recycling. All those things can be managed in a very intelligent manner, with multiple layers of redundancy. But as much as capitalism seems like it has those covered, it's not. The system is very fragile, and it can break. Things can break at any moment. Really, like failures can happen, collapses can happen.
Well, I won't pretend to have read enough of Jacques Fresco's work to like make commentary on it. So there's that. But I will say that I think redundancy is exactly what I was getting at there, right? The idea is that when you engineer a system and you find that there's some sort of like failure mode, your best solution is usually just to create layers of redundancy, right? Where it's like, yeah, well, if that failed, it would suck, but then this part of the system would take up the slack. And then if that failed as well, then this other part of the system would take up the slack. You create more and more of these layers of redundancy where, the failures aren't disastrous, they're localized, right? In fact, it's interesting to say that this isn't only an engineering perspective. This is how the universe like creates stable systems. You look at all of the places where there are complex systems in the universe, and more than the sum of its parts interactions. It always arises from systems where there are enormous arrays of flexible components and very high degrees of redundancy. And it's for precisely the reasons that we've just described. Like that's just how it works. So I think these layers of redundancy in the horizontal method are essentially the federation. So this word federation or confederation or whatever, so there's lots of people that just misunderstand what it means. But the idea is that it's essentially imagine it's like circles in circles, right? You've got a federation, which is essentially an organization that is a container for all of the organizations within it, right? And then it's a place where all of the organizations within it can come together and coordinate, right? They can coordinate together. And then you have a federation of federations and a federation of federations, and you get bigger and bigger and bigger into bigger and bigger scales. And it's not like representation where you're electing them to go make decisions for you. That's representation. That's hierarchy. It's instead that what you're doing is you're making the decisions down at the bottom, and then you are coordinating at the larger scales. So everybody's deliberating down at the bottom, and then you're bringing your decisions to the larger scales. You're delegating people to come together and coordinate and administrate larger distributed systems that you all share together. And so that's, I think, what redundancy looks like at scale, iterating on the global scale for horizontal systems. And there are so many misunderstandings about how that could possibly be organized
Yep.
that it's almost too big of a topic for us. But I do think that is where the answer is. Also, another mechanism for redundancy is that when you have very large arrays of flexible components, it means that if one of the components fails, that everything else doesn't fail. Right? Not to
Sure.
be kind of brutalist about it, but look how an ecosystem works. In an ecosystem, if one deer dies, that doesn't like kill the whole pack, right? The
Yep.
whole
Yep.
the whole herd of deer doesn't die because one deer dies. And that's sort of the point of having tons and tons of deer. That's why reproduction emphasizes more reproduction, that you should want to make more babies, because the more of you there are, the more likely that the deer population continues to exist. So
But
this
it's
is
also
another.
interesting because there's also the keystone species, right? So there are things that if they fall apart,
Totally.
like the wolves, in the
Yeah.
Colorado River. So I'm sorry, but
No, no, that's a good point. In fact, I was literally going to get at it
okay,
next. But yeah, no, that is
awesome.
an example, however, of a disastrous failure mode, right? Like that
Yeah.
nature isn't like there's no designer sitting above being making sure that there are no disastrous failure modes. It's just that as systems iterate forward, systems that are good at iterating will tend to not have disastrous failure modes, right? Like they will tend to distribute more and more, produce more layers of redundancy. But keystone species, of course, always will exist. And I suspect that no matter how good you ever build a system, there will always be kind of like keystone points in the system where it's like, wow, we built this really wonderful distributed network, but damn, when that commune failed, it screwed like 50 communes, right? Like, and of course, that's like it may be literally unavoidable, but you only reduce the risk by attempting to reduce the risk through redundancy, right?
It's beautiful you bring these things up, man, because like it's actually interesting because you said you don't know too much into Jacques Fresco's work, but the things you spoke of, first of all, a lot like pretty much you're the only person I've met that speaks very similar to what Zach talks about. He told me about all these different concepts and such. So I'm sure you guys have had many conversations and um also Jacques Fresco's work. I was more into it before Zach met me, but like it's pretty much talking about along the lines you're talking about. You create systems of redundancy, and the details of it are like basically on a local level, city level, or even like let's say on a nation level. You're trying to figure out the organization, the economic orientation of the society. Like you just have teams of what we call interdisciplinary teams of scientists or who are generalists as well as experts on different matters. You put them together, and they have councils where we research. We do all the R&D necessary for the development of the structure of the society and the technology, and also the social governance. And we constantly keep innovating. You just keep innovating, keep progressing and getting better at it without ever truly getting there. And that's how redundancies can be, and they can be assisted greatly through the technology we have today. Like a lot of the theorists who talked back in the day, they didn't know what is available today with AI, and I'm so lazy. I don't look at enough things that AI can do for me on my business level and all the things of my life. I'm sure there's things that you should be looking into more because it can assist so much. And the redundancy can be really aided by, having feedback systems of like technology, which, here's the tricky part. Like you said, people have a hard time grasping it because when you remove the trade-based competitive gaming mentality of capitalism from the equation, when you remove the hierarchy, the dominance, the materialism, when you remove those things, you can actually create an AI system that can be trusted to, hey, just give you answers. Let's say people want a bridge built somewhere. You go to the system, people input their like ideas, and we can have an actual representative democracy where like the AI can assist and like be like, okay, this guy's thing was more objective. This is more resource efficient to do this. It's less resource efficient to do that. So then, based on Fresco's work, is like you don't talk about morality as much as you talk about what works and what doesn't work. So him being a systems engineer and a social engineer, he talked about those things and what he called the resource based economy, which is not even like whatever. It's not like we have to go by that label exactly. No, call it whatever you want, but a system of intelligent resource management that is guided by heavily redundant systems of resource preservation, all kinds of economic efficiency that has to be built into it.
Yeah, no, it's funny because every time I talk to somebody who's into resource-based economy stuff and we end up talking for just a minute, I'm like, oh, that sounds like anarcho-communism, Like I know that a lot of people bristle at the word communism, but now I've given preface about what I mean. It sounds like you're talking about a stateless, classless, moneyless society wherein distribution goes directly from producers to those who need it, right? Like that is what a resource-based economy is. It's essentially just a really deeply formulated way to do decentralized planning without commodification, right? That's what it sounds like to me when I discuss it with people.
Absolutely. Um, and so like I really I admire the works of people like Peter Joseph, Jacques Fresco, Buckminster Fuller, you know, who have really really embraced this. That listen, these are the things we should be pursuing. You know, both on an ideological value based level, sure, but also on the resource based technological level. Um, Also, I just came to my mind the philosophers back in the day. I forgot which one it was. A Greek philosopher, like maybe thousands of years ago, said something along the lines of, if the work of the slave can be of its own, if the plow can do the work on its own, then there's no need for slavery. Something of that nature. He was like, okay, there's no need for the slave if the work can become automated in a weird way. He was like predicting automation. Basically, yeah, like I'm sure we talked about it before we had this episode, like about how so much of the work that we do today can be automated. That's another form of redundancy that should be done to enable people the freedom to pursue their true passions in life, right? Whether that is creative or whatnot, invention, social contribution, um, and so yeah. What do you
No, I
think?
would tend to agree. I'm definitely one of these people that favors automating as much as we can. In fact, in Cooperation Tulsa, almost every process that we do out on the land, we're immediately having discussions about how it could be automated or sped up with tools and stuff like that. And I think that's really like the direction that it's going to have to move, right? We're going to have to move in this direction where we figure out how to automate things so that we lower the amount of energy we have to spend doing all of these prefigurative tasks. Because, the truth is, it's going to be hard work either way to build this stuff from the ground up, but it could be less
Sure.
hard work if we can figure out ways to just make it easier. But I think that the highest priority is success, right? The highest
Yep.
priority is doing what needs to be done. It is building the coalitions that must be built. And that sometimes requires just discarding the labels for whatever length of time it takes to get the thing done. And then maybe later you can have a discussion about labels. But I think that we do absolutely get obsessed with the labels. And I think that the best example I can think of is among anarchists who shit on communalists, where it's like communalism is so close to anarchism that I've seen people who have knowledge debate back and forth about it. And it is it is exceedingly challenging to actually find things that are huge, significant differences. And yet they're like constantly talking shit about each other. It's ridiculous. If you were to just talk about what it is that you wanted to do, they'd probably fight a lot less. But as soon as they use the labels, they think that the one another is an enemy. And that stuff happens all over the place. You meet a lot of people who just call themselves a socialist, and then what do they mean by that? Like you have to inquire what they mean by it, and often it means nothing like what you would mean. I say I'm a socialist, I mean, oh, worker control. And what they mean is when the government does stuff, right? Like, and then it's like, oh, wow, we are not in the same group. Like me and you, not in the same place. Yeah. So often the labels obscure more than they enlighten.
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, also agree with what you said, that just for the purpose of communication, we have to have labels used in our language. We have to. I mean, let's say I'm doing a lecture to some people about a resource based economy. I have to eventually call it like, okay, in a resource based economy, we do this, we do that. But I guess what I would mean is like when we get to the end stage, when we're getting to the success that we're trying to envision, um, then the labels can eventually be phased out because we don't want any form of institutional self preservation. We don't want any kind of established way of thinking that has itself entrenched and unchangeable. We want like variance in thinking, and we have to have an adaptive mindset to change to the ever changing world. Yeah, awesome. So tell the people who are watching about the project you have over there, what you have going on.
So Cooperation Tulsa is a communalist group, although it's basically just filled with a bunch of anarchists. And it's kind of based on Cooperation Jackson. So Cooperation Jackson was a group that was created in Jackson, Mississippi, and is still very successful. And they set out to create cooperatives and community gardens and popular assemblies where people are brought together in order to make decisions together. And it has been highly successful. In 2020, during the George Floyd protests, myself and an indigenous elder named Roberto Mendoza, he got his start all the way back in the 60s during the American Indian movement. Me and him got together and we created Cooperation Tulsa. And Cooperation Tulsa has a very similar aim: create worker cooperatives, create community gardens and agricultural projects, and restore the ecology and return the land into the power of the people, and create general assemblies and popular assemblies, get the people together to have discussions at the scale of the city and neighborhoods and city blocks and stuff like that. And that's been our approach. We've been doing it since 2020, and the group is continuing to grow. Pretty much every time I pitch it, I just want to solicit donations, because that is indeed how we get the money that we use to dump into all of our projects. We get recurring monthly donations, small recurring monthly donations from a large number of people. And month by month, we budget and we invest what we are given. So I just want to encourage you, if you feel like you want to support the group from afar, if you are interested in trying to help us grow, but you feel like the only thing you got is a little bit of extra money lying around, please go to our open collective and become a recurring donor. And that would be enormously helpful for us.
Yeah. So yeah, man, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And
Yeah,
hopefully we keep this going. Hopefully we have more discussions talking about different nuances of society in general. And yeah,
sounds good to me. I appreciate you having me on.
definitely I'll stay in touch. If I have any questions, I'll run it by you for sure.
Sounds good to me. Thanks for having me on. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you, brother. Talk
Bye.
to you. Bye.